All right. All right, people are just logging in here. Welcome everyone to Master Gardeners Presents. We'll get started in a few minutes.
And while we're waiting for everyone to enter, if anyone has any miscellaneous gardening questions, we can entertain those now.
Anyone logging in have random questions before we get started? We're taking them. You got some Master Gardeners here to answer. All right, our numbers are starting to slow down a little bit. Welcome, everyone. We're going to give it another minute or two to let people log in and get settled before we get started. Okay. Hello, everyone. I'm Jill Vanning. I'm from the Kimberly Library, and I'm also a Master Gardener with the Outagamie County Master Gardeners. And we are at Master Gardeners Presents here, where we have monthly programs that are about gardening. I am here with Mary Lou Sriff and Tom Wenzel and Rob Turner. Mary Lou, you want to tell us a little bit about today's program?
Sure. Rob Turner is a former soil biologist, and he is also an urban farmer. He was trained by Dr. Elaine Ingham. And for those of you that may not know of who she is, but she's considered by many to be the world's foremost soil biologist, and she's also founder of the Dr. Elaine's Soil Food Web Incorporated. And Rob is also trained in making K&F inputs for the soil from natural ingredients that you already have in your backyard to use as healthy, cheap alternatives to conventional fertilizers and pesticides. So he'll be going over what the soil food web is and how you can become maybe using some of the things you have around in your yard to help your soil. So, Rob?
All right. So I'm going to try to answer questions and talk at the same time. I'm okay at it. I'm a teacher full-time, so I'm pretty good at it. But like Mary Lou said, I have a background in soil biology, and I use all of the practices that I've learned in an urban setting, which I know a lot of us do. But a lot of these will apply up and outwards to larger scales as well, especially the K&F style inputs are very, very popular on large scale farms because they're inexpensive. So I'm just going to get started here, share my screen. So I'm going to give you a little bit of a background on the soil, what's in it, and how all of those parts kind of work together. This is the stuff that you don't see. At very best, you might see some of the very largest things that I'm going to talk about in the soil, but most of this is all going on a really small scale that you can only see under a microscope. Just want to double check, make sure the screen's good. Give me a thumbs up if you can see it. All right, so we'll get going. So knowing what's going on in your soil and being aware is super, super important. So a little background, photosynthesis. And I know this is for most of us that garden, we understand how this works, but it kind of sets the stage for the next steps in the process. So everything starts with the sun. And from there, we work through creating products, right? So the plant itself is taking stuff from the atmosphere and from the ground. So we have our carbon dioxide and water, and that's making sugars. So this will CH2O in the plant leaf, and it's giving off oxygen and water. Okay, so it kind of bypasses the water through a lot of this process. But essentially what's happening is the plant is binding sugar into all of the cells inside of the plants. So as that process builds up, for us from the top level, we always see, green plants, fruits growing, but underneath there's a whole nother story going on beneath the soil. So about half of the energy in a plant that's being created in the forms of sugars is actually down in the roots in the soil. So you notice here, my little roots coming down, all those sugars are coming down with it. And I always like to refer to these as the cakes and donuts. So cakes and donuts for all of the little critters that are in the soil. So who's living down here? There's all kinds of little critters that we can't see. The basis of this starts with bacteria and fungus, and they feed on these cakes and donuts. So they really, really enjoy that stuff. So we have all these little cakes and donuts hanging out on our plant roots. And who doesn't like cakes and donuts? So Bob, a little bacteria guy, he likes cake and he likes donuts. And all of our soils, even the ones that are the most damaged, usually have at least bacteria in them. Okay, so they're hanging out in the soil. A very efficient system won't run on just bacteria by itself. So we need a couple more players in the system. But basically, what the plants are doing is they're creating things called exudates, which I refer to as the cakes and donuts. It's all kinds of stuff. It's dead plant cells. It's stuff that sloughs off as the roots grow through the soil, acids and enzymes, and sugar that the plant creates as a byproduct of photosynthesis, right? And this is all waste products that get eaten by the bacteria in the soil. Okay, and this is a cool symbiotic relationship in our soil because both of these organisms benefit. So the bacteria are getting free food and they are giving the plant some stuff in return. So what does that look like? So as Bob hangs out here, they're about 5 parts carbon. So every bacteria is about 5 parts carbon and 1 part nitrogen. So that's our plant food, right? And carbon is kind of the leftover sugars and stuff that the plant leaves behind. So when a bacteria dies, it actually leaves nitrogen in the soil. And you probably know a lot about how corn and soybeans have a nice relationship with each other because there's a bacteria in a soybean root that when it dies, it leaves behind nitrogen in the soil that the following year the corn can take advantage of. Okay, so this other guy, Frank, he hangs out in the soil too. This is the one that tends to be missing in soils that are not taken care of and not covered. Fungus are a little bit more picky about where they live. But essentially his job is to cut the cake into smaller pieces so that the bacteria can break down those nutrients and utilize them. So in general, and there's lots of different types of fungus, but in general, fungus are decomposers, right? So they're breaking down this complicated large cake into the smaller pieces. And part of that reason behind that is the plant cells are made out of cellulose and lignin, which are really, really hard to break down, but fungus specializes in breaking down those 2 types of materials. All right, so we're still in the roots here. So a little review. So we got the cake coming from the roots. Frank's breaking it down into smaller pieces that Bob can eat. Okay. And the cool part is at that point, the bacteria can utilize all the simple sugars that the fungus essentially breaks down for them to use. All right, so as we go forward, remember, keep all of this in the back of your mind. So this is the basis of the food chain in the soil food web. All right, so part of the problem with these bacteria, right? So remember, they're 5 parts carbon, 1 part nitrogen, but it's locked up in the bacteria, right? So they are alive. Bacteria don't want to die. They don't want to give up their free nitrogen, but they do sometimes. The key is to advance your soil food web past this point to make it more efficient. So how do we do that? So we got a couple other players that hang out in the soil. We have flagellates and amoebas. So these are what we refer to as protozoans in general. And these are essentially, kind of imagine them kind of like the lions and the tigers of the soil food web, and the bacteria are the antelope, right? So they're running around and they're looking for meals of bacteria to eat. So the cool thing about the protozoans is they create waste just like all of us, right? And so when they eat bacteria, they give off all of those soluble forms of nitrogen that our plants need to grow, right? And this is just an example with nitrogen. This happens with a lot of different nutrients and minerals. But essentially, they're a little bigger. They're made up of a little more carbon and a little less nitrogen. And there's a byproduct that's given off. So we get a NH4 and ammonium, which is 2 of the things that we tend to buy commercially, right? We take those and pay cash money for those at the store. Okay, so that all gets dropped down in the soil. So then the next level up, so we have this other predator. So this is a nematode. I'm sure that some of you have run into the non-beneficial type that tend to eat the roots and do other nasty things. But a majority of the nematodes in the soil are actually converting the bacteria and fungus and other nematodes and all of those other things that we described into plant available forms of nutrients. So it's literally like everybody eats everybody and poops out plant food. Okay, the other cool thing about nematodes is they tend to also consume disease-causing organisms. So there's nematodes out there that are very specific, eating only certain types of things. There are some types of nematodes that just eat other nematodes, especially the ones that are harmful to our plants. So there's a whole world down there of little tiny worms that we don't see. If you have lots and lots of these in your soil, you may see some of the very biggest ones. They may be visible with the naked eye, but they are definitely easier to see with a microscope. All right, so a little review back to the food chain here. So I have all of my pieces. Okay, so all these arrows are pointing to things that are getting eaten, right? So the fungus is breaking down the cake, the bacteria is eating the simple sugars, the protozoans are eating the bacteria, the nematodes are eating everybody, okay, because they're the biggest one out there. And they're all creating nitrogen that's going to the plant root. So this is the trade, right? So this is that beneficial relationship trade of plant gives up a little bit of its carbon and it gets a lot of different nutrients that are readily available in return. So carbon nitrogen ratio, if you compost, this might look familiar. But this is where the math comes in and why having a very healthy food web can be so productive in terms of putting a lot of nitrogen into your soil. So if you notice, for example, a protozoan is 30-1. So it has to eat 5 bacteria to maintain its 30 carbon, but then it also has 5 nitrogens, but it only needs 1. So then that waste product of nitrogen is 4. Okay, and that's the stuff that's given off into the soil. So I'll give you a little example here. So if protozoan eats 6 bacteria, it has too many nitrogens for its carbon to nitrogen ratio, and it dumps off 5 extra nitrogens into the soil. And a nematode, if you have a bacterial nematode, they eat a lot more and they only need a small amount of nitrogen too. And so in this case, the nematode is eating bacteria. If it eats 20 bacteria, it's giving away 19 free units of nitrogen into the soil. Okay, and that's where, as you go up the food chain, you start to get more and more nutrient cycling that's just being done by the living portion of the soil. And that's all plant soluble nutrients, whether it's nitrogen or phosphorus, or the small little things like calcium, all those things that our plants need. So the earthworm. So this is my past history of working as a soil biologist. I worked a lot with earthworms. The earthworm is really cool because it has all of these things in its guts. So if you have earthworms in your soil, you have a lot of these microbes available to you because they live in the worm's gut and then they get pooped out as the worm eats things. Okay. Earthworms are really good at breaking down soil particles into more manageable pieces. And they are also really good at aerating the soil. So the more earthworms you have in your system, the better. All right, so how do you add microbes? So if you're starting a new patch, maybe your soil has been a little naked for a while and hasn't had a lot of plants on it, and you want to start this process, right? This cycling process. So if you add the correct types of microbes to the soil, you increase your nutrient cycling, you increase your micronutrients, you increase soil structure and water infiltration, so you hold more water, which the microbes and the plants love. You also help disease suppression. So when you have a healthy ecosystem of microbes, essentially what happens is all the parking spots are taken up by good microbes, and the disease type microbes aren't able to actually get in and cause the diseases. The other cool thing that microbes can do, a lot of them are specialized, they can degrade pollutants in the soil. So we did some research breaking down oil and other contaminants in soil with just microbes. There's been a lot of stuff in the news lately about finding microbes that can break down plastics. If there's an excess, microbes are going to take advantage of it. Okay, and then obviously increasing the biodiversity in your system is super important too. So here's, this is the official soil food web image, right? And so we started here at the very bottom. So we have bacteria and fungus and nematodes. And then above that, those are the things that we start to see in our system, right? So the smaller arthropods that shred stuff up, the birds that eat them, the animals that kind of move around and stir things up in our soil. They're all part of that process. They're essentially taking the big things and breaking them down into the smaller stuff. So microbes in the soil, they really, really decrease the further down you go. So that top 6 inches of soil is where almost all that microbial biomass is. Okay? And that's usually where the roots are for most of our plants. And that's because that relationship between things growing in the soil and the microbes grabbing those nutrients off the roots. Okay? If you have plants that go deeper, there's going to be microbes associated with those roots, but a majority of stuff kind of stays in that top 6 inches. We can skip that one for now. But just to give you an idea of the system, right? So we start with photosynthesis, we decompose stuff, the mutualists take over and help enhance your plant growth. And the hope is that anything in this group here, right? The pathogens, the parasites, and the root feeders that are all in our soil are all being eaten by the rest of the food web. So when the food web's balanced, you don't get these huge excesses of issues with parasites or pathogens. And then going up the food chain, shredders, things like earthworms and the bigger macro arthropods. And then the really high level predators like nematodes that eat other nematodes. And then the other things that sometimes we aren't a fan of, like mice and voles and shrews and birds in our gardens. They are actually part of the system, helping to break that stuff down, but they also keep some of these animals and arthropods in check too. So if you get an overgrowth of one type of arthropod, that can become problematic, and that's where the birds and the other things that eat insects like mice and voles and shrews are coming in there to kind of clean up that mess. All right, so 2 ways that you can do this. You can inoculate your soil with solids or liquids. There's lots of different ways to do this. You can take straight earthworm castings, you can use compost, you can find healthy soil in a forest, and you can steal microbes from there. But really all you have to do is get them started and then take care of them. And there's lots of different ways to do that. But this is a couple examples of what that might look like. So if you have proper microbial levels, there's a few pictures here that I just want to show you what this looks like. So when your nitrogen system is cycling correctly, you get healthier looking leaves, right? If your fungal balance is correct. So notice how this part that we treated is nice and green and tall and doesn't have as many dandelions as the rest of this grassy area. That's because the fungus is helping balance the soil there. And it's helping to break down those nutrients and make it more readily available so that the dandelions don't have to do that. Misconceptions aside, yes, dandelions are weeds, but they're there for a reason. And we can talk about that a little bit too. Here's a couple more images. So this is a lawn. The back row here is treated with castings and microbes, and this front part isn't. So you can kind of see the difference in color. This is what that same soil looks like when you take a plug out. So you have this very shallow rooted kind of gunk versus these plants here that were treated with microbes are growing much healthier and the soil is more aerated. And that's all a process that takes time, right? This isn't something that is going to happen instantly, but it takes a little bit of time for those microbes to get established, especially in something like a lawn, because we tend to treat our lawns not very great for microbe health. Here's a couple other pictures here showing different microbe levels. The bigger plants that look healthier have higher levels of microbial inputs in the soil. And this is part of the reason why compost works so well, right? We all have had this experience, right? Where the giant pumpkin grows out of our compost pile and the leaves are bigger than your dog. That's because it's a healthy microbial system there, right? And the plants love that. So that's one of those things that, you know, if we slow down and look at it for a little bit, we kind of realize that the microbes are part of the reason why this plant is so healthy. Right? So leaves that are insanely big, stems that are, you know, very, very healthy looking, right? So making these microbes work for you. Let's see here. So here's a picture of a fungus that is taken out of a compost pile and put under a microscope. You can kind of see how far-reaching these are just from this little chunk of stuff that they're kind of all attached to. They essentially increase the surface area for a plant's root system for gathering nutrients by hundreds of folds, right? They're expanding a plant's root system immensely far from where the plant is actually sitting, right? And we talked a little bit about fungus. There's a lot of different types of fungus. This is one somebody in the questions here before we started asked about. So things like AM fungus, okay, these aren't the ones that wake up in the morning. These are arbuscular mycorrhizal fungus. So they're actually growing into the plant cell, right? And they have this direct relationship where they're taking carbon directly from the plant cells and bringing nutrients in from the outside. Whereas fungus like this this fungus is taking more of the approach of breaking things down in the soil so that the microbes that are smaller, like the bacteria, can take advantage of it, which in turn feeds the plant. So there's kind of these 2 or 3 different groups of fungus that we experience in the soil that kind of trade resources in a little bit of different ways. If you have a really healthy plant that has this ectomycofungus in it, you can actually see it on the roots. It makes the roots appear white and it looks like there's a fungus growing on them. This relationship is only applicable in about 2% of plants. Blueberries are one that this is a relationship with. There's a very specific fungus that makes blueberries grow better in the soil. But essentially their job is to grab things like phosphorus and sulfur and nitrogen and bring it to the plant. Here's some cool pictures of some protozoans. So these are a little bit more in depth than my cartoons, but they still look pretty cool. So this one right here that's circled in red, that's an amoeba. So amoebas are in that group of protozoans that they just eat a lot of bacteria and they poop out a lot of plant nutrients. And then this little brown tube looking thing here, that's a fungal strand that broke off when we sampled that soil sample, right? And so we get to see what types of species there are. You can go in really in depth with something like this and you can identify a lot of these species, but really when it comes down to it, we've only cataloged about 5% of the microbes that live in soil. It's getting better now with a lot of the advances in how we analyze those things. But one of the hardest things to do is to grab microbes like this and then try to grow them in a petri dish. They just don't like it. There's something about our potato petri dishes that they just don't enjoy as much as living in the soil. So it's good to look at them directly. I hope this video works, but this will show you a little bit of what the moving part of the soil looks like when it's very concentrated with these little critters. So we'll see if this works. Doesn't look like it's letting me play it. Let's see here. We'll try it this way. Oh yeah, here we go. You see all these little things swimming around in this liquid. So this is just water and soil, right? And you see these little squiggles. Those are the flagellates that are swimming around. They essentially just whip their little tail around and it causes them to move, right? It's not the most efficient way to move. Here's another one that shows a lot of these. So you can see them moving around to the point where it's almost like mass chaos. They're literally just chasing bacteria and eating them. And that's what they do all day long. Okay, so when you have very high concentrations of these critters, zoom in on this one too, you can cycle a lot of nutrients. So this one shows, so this is another cool type of fungus that isn't technically a fungus. It's more like a bacteria, but it's really good at nutrient cycling. But again, you can see all of these little things swimming around in here. And those are all of your nutrient cyclers. Okay, and if you are super curious about something like this, you can actually just buy a relatively cheap microscope, or maybe you can rent one or borrow one from a friend, or maybe you know somebody that works at a university that lets you borrow one. You can actually look at your soil and see what kinds of critters are floating around in there. So one more little story that I want to tell before we kind of open it up for questions. One of the things that is kind of near and dear to my heart is trying to reduce the amount of synthetic toxic stuff that we put on our soil, right? There's synthetics that are perfectly fine, but there's stuff that is very much toxic. Sorry about that.
If you were not able to talk to a teacher that you needed to this evening.
So what this looks like.
Thank you so much. Have a good night.
So what is a weed? A weed is just a plant, right? And we have this big category and all these ones that we hate, right? My favorite one is the bindweed. It tends to invade just about everything. But essentially it's just a wild plant that's growing where we don't want it to be, right? And usually it's in competition with something that we're trying to grow. This is a fun little comic here, right? So tiptoe through the tulips, but now it's just weedy season, right? That early August weed season. So what do the weeds tell us? So the weeds tell us that we have low biological activity, and that there's an imbalance in the stuff that's in the soil. So most of the time that's the mineral portion of the soil. And there's actually a slot for each specific environment. So weeds grow in specific places because that's their favorite place to grow. So dandelions are always the one I like to use because everybody has one or has had one in a garden or in your lawn. The reason they're there is because your soil is low in calcium, and they are very good at putting down a really deep taproot and pulling that calcium back up into the surface. They're also there because of bad soil biological activity. It just allows them to proliferate. And what happens when you have low biological activity, things like mowing the grass, creates this huge amount of extra hormones and nutrient and thing that's going into the soil that's not being broken down. And a lot of those are signals to the weed seeds that are in the soil to wake up and start doing their thing. So what do they do for us? They bring a lot of minerals to the surface soil layer, you know, that top 6 inches where we're growing a lot of our stuff. And they're very good at doing things with micronutrients. So we always kind of focus on this NPK that we buy at the store, but plants need a lot more than that. And especially if you're growing plants for food, making sure that they have high amounts of nutrition in them are super, super important, because we all want to eat nutrient dense food, right? So mullein and dandelions, everybody's seen mullein before. It's pretty common around here. It's a little more common in the central part of the state, but if you take 100 grams of leaves, it contains 1,200 milligrams of calcium. So almost 1.5% of that plant is calcium. Okay, and there's 20 milligrams of iron. Dandelions are also a big pull on calcium. So you have about 540 grams of calcium, or milligrams of calcium, sorry, and 8.4 milligrams of iron in that same 100 grams of leaves, right? And so they're very, very good at moving minerals around. This is one of my favorite plants, by the way. So when you use plants like these, weeds or other types of plants in a crop rotation, they help us break up hard pans, things that like to feed deeply, right? So if you have really hard soil, these are the weeds you're going to see. Things like ragweed, lamb's quarter, thistles, sunflowers. They all have really deep root systems, and they're really good at unpacking all of our compacted soil. And especially around here, we all have heavy clay, or maybe you're blessed and you don't have that heavy clay, but most people in this area do. These are probably more common around here than they are in other places. Okay, this is what's happening, right? These plants, this is a sunflower root that you see here kind of going down, and they have this insanely powerful root system. And then the cool part is when they die, right? So when these die back in the wintertime, that little hole is full of organic material that's really good at soaking up water. The weeds feed microbes and other important organisms. So things like cow parsnip and giant hogweed actually attract predatory wasps and flies that help get rid of crop pests, right? So these are the flies that essentially use their different pests to complete their life cycle, right? And so they're there to help. If there's an imbalance, usually these plants are going to pop up. These are also good to have around, even though some of them are toxic. If you have pets, you might not want to have them around. But weeds are really good at bringing water and other nutrients to the surface. These are all prairie plants, but technically weeds, right? If they're in the wrong place. If you look right over here on the far left, that's turf grass. It's not really good at putting roots down into the soil. The weeds hold the nutrient and the mineral and keep it from getting blown away. And then they're also part of this succession, right? And so this is a process that we see in lots of different places. So when you have exposed surface, right? So maybe you just tilled or you bought a house and you're just planting the lawn, you're going to deal with a lot of these problems because your soil is bacterial dominant. And so you're going to have things like lichens and grasses and weeds, mixed up herbaceous plants. You might even get shrubs in there. As our soils go more and more fungal dominant, so if you're growing things like fruit trees, you're going to want to have microbes that push your soil a little bit more fungally dominant. Things like mulch can kind of promote some of that if it's used correctly. But really, you want to treat whatever you're growing like it would grow in a successional process like this. This is how the earth works. If there's a naked part of the earth, the first thing that's there is a lichen, and that starts to break the rock down and turn it into soil. And then the mosses come in and they die and they create topsoil. And then the grasses come in, they die and create more topsoil. And the more material you have, the more attractive it is to fungal dominant species. Okay, and they'll come in and they'll break down all of these leaves and the twigs and all that stuff that's falling in the forest. This is also a place where you can kind of steal your own microbes from too. If you need fungal microbes, you can go out in the woods and grab them. I'll talk a little bit about that. So why do we get these bacteria in our yards and in our gardens? Lots of chemicals tend to kill stuff. It's a side effect of a lot of those chemicals is that they are killing the microbes that are in the soil. Usually the only thing that hangs around after lots and lots of treatments are bacteria. If you disturb stuff, if you till it or burn it, adding things like fertilizer, if you have flood, toxic spills, those are all things that are going to cause those issues, right? Pushing us back further into this succession stage. So this gets a little bit more into the cation soil testing weeds, but in general, it's very important to not only balance your microbes, but also to make sure that the chemistry in your soil is pretty well balanced too, because they depend on that, right? They're using all of these different nutrients to do their microbial thing. And if these are out of balance, then the microbes have a hard time getting established and then staying established. If you're super curious about how these numbers work, you can by all means email me and I'll explain that in a little more depth. Okay, but essentially, if I have things like lamb's quarters, okay, so the crazy thing about seeds in the soil, especially weed seeds, is they can pretty much stay dormant longer than we live. A lot of these species have seeds that will live hundreds of years in the soil, just waiting for their opportunity, right? And you're talking about on an acre, you're talking about 130 million seeds, and they're there. They're everywhere. They're in the soil you get from the city. They're in compost that you buy. There's seeds everywhere. Lamb's quarters is a really good example. This is one of the more common weeds that you see in a garden. They can make 500,000 seeds in one season. One plant can make that many seeds in a season, right? And so getting these guys before they seed out is important. Okay, but they're there for a reason. This one is a fun one. It's that sticky one, right? The one that always gets on your clothes. These weeds can also be indicators of good things. So that lamb's quarters and pigweed that you see in your garden, the reason why they're there is because they like fertility. When you have good fertile soil, they're going to show up. Yeah, they're a weed, they're annoying, but they're actually telling you that you have good fertility in your soil. The cocklebur can tell you that you have a good phosphate level in your soil if you're seeing that. Things like these little clumps of grass, which I always try to clean up, but you always miss one, right? If you have excess organic material, these are the things that get created. So if your decay process hits pause because your microbes can't keep up with this big pile, you make things like formaldehyde and methane and ethane and butane, all those fun anes that happen when things decompose. And those are those signals. So when there's certain levels of things like formaldehyde or ethane in the soil, it tells that seed bank, yo, it's your turn to wake up and use up that excess that's in the soil. This is a fun one. Creeping bent grass is always one that gets on any person that mows grass's nerves. But really this one is showing you that you have really high moisture levels and bad drainage in your soil. This thing likes it wet. Here's our mullein again. This one tells you that you have low calcium, phosphorus, sulfur, and humic acids in the soil. That's why you see this one a lot more in the central part of the state where it's all sand, because the sand is missing a lot of these things. Everybody knows that one, right? Purslane. This tells you that you have high potassium and magnesium in your soil, okay? And that your calcium and phosphate levels are low. Okay, and then you also have low aerobic microbes. So you need to aerate your soil and you need to increase some of these low level nutrients to kind of keep that weed in check. Here's some quackgrass. This one's usually tells you that you don't have very good fertilization water, and this is a mower height problem too. But essentially this one pops up in August because it's dry. Here's our ever favorite dandelion. This one's telling you that calcium's weak. It's also telling you that your zinc level is good, right? But these are all just sending us messages about our soil. There's a lot of literature on this that you can look up that pesky weed in your backyard and be like, oh, I can probably guess what's going on without even having a soil test. Plantain is another one that's real popular around here. This one loves tight acidic clay, which is literally the definition of the whole county. And these are really good at tilling up soil. Their root is very good at getting down and breaking apart really tight soil. Quackgrass, this is always a fun one, but same idea. You have tight soils that don't have a lot of air or fungal growth, so that biological portion is messed up. Ragweed, this is one that gets really common in the late season, right? And the reason why this is common in the late season is because you have the wrong form of potassium. When we start to get dried out, that potassium changes format and it's a wake up signal for that ragweed to come out. Thistle, this one is a signal that your manganese and your iron ratio is out of whack. The best way to take care of this is to literally cut it when it looks like this. So when it's put all of its energy into its flowers before it makes seeds, you just chop it off right at the bottom. And then you can leave that root in the soil to decompose because all the energy is stuck in the flowers. And it won't come back most times, unless it's real stubborn. So this is what a soil test looks like. If you've ever sent one in and they send you back this number and tell you to put some 10, 10, 10 on or something like that, that's a very basic soil analysis. This one is much more in depth. It takes care of pretty much all of the things that you would need. Nitrogen, sulfates, your phosphates, calcium, magnesium, potassium, a few of the major micronutrients. Those are all done on a test like this. And then the nice part is they give you recommendations. So if your nitrogen's low, you can get recommendations based on commercial, industrial style fertilizers, or you can use things like protein meal, which is a more organic approach. If your potassium is low, you need that mineral. right? If your iron level is low, you need that mineral and you have to get that balanced in the soil to help support those microbes. Okay, and there's lots of different options for this. A test like this is about $20, unless the prices have gone up this year. I'm not sure, I haven't checked yet. But last year they were about $20, and you get all this information to make some better decisions for growing stuff. All right. So that was my crash course in soil microbes and soil health. So you can start hitting me with all the questions if you want to.
You should have a Q&A box on the bottom of your screen if you have questions for Rob. That was very informative.
I do have one
I
question.
always struggle to like give you the basics and then not go too far down the rabbit hole, because I've been all the way to the bottom of that one. And I'd just like to share it with everybody, but sometimes it's a lot to get all in one little session.
I think it's interesting with the weeds having purpose and why they're there.
Yeah, and that's
Is
Eric-
compost tea something that people should consider? And
Yeah, so-
how would the homeowner make that?
yeah. So compost tea, the key with that is to have good compost. So if you start out with bad compost, the tea is not going to help. You can buy compost, but it's iffy at best. If it comes with a soil biology test and it tells you what's in it, it might be more informative, but really you can do this in your backyard, right? The key is making sure you have diverse food sources that are well aerated, and you don't want your compost pile to get too hot. And then it's really, you can either apply the compost by itself and then water it in, but compost is kind of valuable, right? It's hard to make good compost and lots of it if you need it. So you can soak it in water and kind of strip those microbes off into the liquid and then apply the liquid directly. The other option is to actually brew your own tea. So then what you're doing essentially at that point is becoming your own microbiologist, right? So you're setting up a food source for those microbes. You're making sure they have lots of oxygen because you don't want any of this stuff to go anaerobic. And then you can multiply them, right? So then you can maximize the critters that are already in your compost pile. That's a little bit touch and go. It takes a little bit of practice, but Elaine has a great manual that can kind of teach you how to do that on small scale, and then you can go really big with it if you want to. We used to do it in 200-gallon vats. So
Yeah, one of our local compost dealers is Peterson Compost. I'm not sure if you're aware of them, but they have.
I haven't heard of them, no.
Okay. It's a dairy farm, organic dairy farm. So anyway, if people would like more information on that, they can submit a question to Gardner SOS@outagamy.net. And or you can contact us through the Outagamy Master Gardener website, and
Sure.
you can get a link to Gardner SOS and submit any questions that you have.
So my only concern with anything cow manure based, in terms of tea, right? It's a great fertilizer. You can put it into your compost pile to kind of warm it up a little bit if you need to. But it tends to be anaerobic, right? It sits in a pile. If it doesn't get turned on a regular basis, sometimes you get pockets of anaerobic microbes. And some of those can be ones that can make us sick too, right? So I'm always real cautious with any cow manure that's not well aged, right? If it's a pile of cow manure that's been in a pile for 3-4 years and it's had time to do its whole process, then that's good. But if it's fresh stuff, you got to be real careful. Now
Yeah,
on the flip,
Peterson uses the row composting method.
okay, he windrows it. So yeah, that's
Yeah.
probably pretty good resource.
Yeah.
The other thing that you can do is you can actually send in a sample of it, right? You can buy some of that compost and you can send it into the Soil Food Web network and get it tested. And they'll tell you exactly what microbes are in it, right down to the types of nematodes. That test is a little bit more expensive, but it does help you get started with the right microbes. And then on the flip side of that, the K&F methodology of making kind of these cheaper inputs with stuff that you have, that's a whole nother process, right? And you're using green plant matter and fruit bodies that you throw away to make inputs that help key up certain stages of the plant, right? And you can use cow manure to do that. A lot of that process is based in making lactic acid bacteria, which you can get from rice and milk, and you can grow your own, which is kind of a cool way to get that basic part of your ecosystem started, right? That's a huge source of microbiology that all the rest of the food web loves. So it's a really good stimulant for getting things going.
Someone asked if this is going to be available to watch later, and it is. This was recorded, and it will be on the Kimberly Public Library YouTube channel for a short time. And I think it goes on the Master Gardener website still as well.
Yeah, I see there's a question here from Mary. The reference that I mentioned. So Elaine Ingham, she is the soil food web guru. She started her career as a marine biologist and noticed all of the interactions there, and then made that same relationship with the soil. And she literally wrote the book. She's done the research. She knows exactly how to talk to the microbes. Some of the research that I've seen her do, she's taken soil that is essentially toxic for growing plants and done nothing but adjusted it with microbes and made it working healthy soil again. So microbes are super, super powerful. Like I said, when we used to make these big vats of microbes, I did a lot of experimenting on how to make them quiet and put them in a bottle, because then it's easier to hand out to all of you, right? And have you use it. I was using things like pretty high level, like citric acid, to bring down the pH of these things. And you'd put it in there and the pH of the solution would drop down to like 4, and you'd come back an hour later and the microbes had adjusted it back to 7. Right. And so they literally just chewed up all that crap that I put in there and spit it out in its elemental format, and then made their home back to the way that they wanted it. So it builds a lot of resilience into your garden or your lawn when you use these microbes. One of a good resource, so if you Google the Compost Tea Brewing Manual by Elaine Ingham, there's a free version of this somewhere, but there is a pay for copy on Amazon too. But this is the book that essentially would teach you how to brew your own tea, make healthy compost, and brew your own tea. And I think she has this linked on her website too. And I also have a copy of it that I could share with you guys and have you link into the YouTube video too, if you wanted to do that. All right, let's see here. Clinton's got a question. Weeds. Yeah, so here's the question for everybody that can't see it. So if weeds have beneficial purposes, then when you're weeding, should you leave the weeds where you pulled them? Yeah, you can do that. I tend to remove them if there's seeds or the formation starting of seeds, because you don't want to leave that in there. But you can definitely leave that stuff there. If you like stuff neat, then put the weeds in your compost, turn them into compost, and then put that back in the garden, right? It's going to be the same effect. The other benefit of kind of chop and drop weeding is you keep the soil covered, right? And so you have all these little critters in the soil and they don't like the sun. So the more covering you have, the more healthy that system is going to stay, the more water you're going to hold in your soil. So keeping things covered is really important. And that's really what weeds are doing. You know, we like our stuff all neat and in rows, with dirt in between our onions and our carrots, right? And the weeds are like, yo, that shouldn't be like that. And they want to come in and start that pioneer process. And so they're going to just jump right in there and fill in that space that we left open. And again, this is a whole nother option too, but doing things like interseeding where you're growing multiple crops in one place, which helps keep things covered, can be really beneficial too.
Awesome. Does anyone else have any more questions? So thank you for coming, and thank you, Rob. That was so informative. I loved
Sure.
it.
And here's, if anybody's curious about the weeds stuff and what they're indicating, this one right here, Weeds Control Without Poisons by Charles Walters. He has a list of like, I think there's like 130 or so of the really common weeds and why they're there. It's a really good read if you're interested in that kind of stuff. And then the balancing, the soil balancing stuff is in Neil Kinsey's Hands-On Agronomy. And he talks about it from the perspective of like a large scale farmer, but a lot of those things apply to us on the smaller level too. And then if you're real curious or you got questions or you want to know where to get one of these fancy soil tests, just shoot me an email or give me a phone call. I'd be more than happy to answer any other questions if you think of them tomorrow or hopefully a month from now when we start planting stuff outside.
Can't even see the soil now.
I had hope there for like a week. I was like, hey, if it's going to be 40, I'm just going to plant onions in February this year and see what happens. But it changed its mind.
All right. Well, next month, Master Gardener Presents is going to be in person. It's going to be at the Kimberly Library, and we're going to be starting some seeds. So March 27th. Tom, did you want to close us out with something?
Well, just back to the statement, if you've got any questions for Rob or any other general gardening questions, you can contact us at gardenersos@outagamy.net, or you can also get to us through our website, ocmga.net, or just Google Outagamie County Master Gardeners.
All right. Well, thanks again, Rob. I'm going to be closing out the session. Remember, next month, Master Gardeners is in person with seed starting. It does require registration, so you'll have to call the library to get a spot in that class. So hopefully we'll see some of you then. Thanks, everyone.
Yep. Thanks, everybody. Have a good night.
Bye.